Despite having wildly different ideas about what makes for a good diet, the alt-health grifters all agree on one thing. The dietary guidelines and the experts who make them are wrong.
Guidelines are wrong.
This is the worst possible advice.
Is it any wonder that as humans in this country, we are so unhealthy?
My plate guidelines, that is also a fad diet.
The fact that our health guidelines aren't set on, hey, what you should be eating is what human beings are designed to eat in nature.
The dietary recommendation to prioritize carbohydrates produced a veritable epidemic of obesity and diabetes.
And the result is the worst epidemic of obesity and type 2 diabetes and heart disease in the history of our species.
Each clown in this circus has a different story about the details, but the final picture is the same. Americans were generally doing just fine. The government created the guidelines. Those guidelines were wrong. We followed those wrong guidelines. We got sick and fat. It's a simple and flexible story. Whatever your diet fad, you can point to how the guidelines suppressed your proven 100% healthy diet system. But is it true? I'm not going to drag this out. No. They're wrong, they don't know where the guidelines came from, in many cases they don't know what the guidelines say, and the guidelines aren't the horror that these grifters make them out to be. But the guidelines aren't without flaws either. And if we can recognize those flaws in context of the bigger picture, we can better protect ourselves from false health claims and make better choices about the food that we eat. So, let's start by looking at the current guidelines. Really, the biggest headache started with the food guide pyramid, so let's take it back to... No, I guess technically it started with the modern guidelines in 1977. You know what? The guidelines weren't made in a vacuum. They have a history, and that history informs the choices that got us to where we are today. So, we're taking it back. All the way back to the 1800s. Before 1894, the US federal government didn't have much to say about nutrition. But an absence of official recommendations didn't mean nutrition was simple or that people just knew what to eat. Some people were convinced by early influencers like Sylvester Graham and John Kellogg that bland, plant-forward diets were the key to physical health and the suppression of our wild lusts. And others were convinced that starches and milk were the enemy, buying into the dietary advice of William Banting, who is arguably the first American keto influencer. Women were expected to look thin and hourglass-shaped, but not too thin. American men were supposedly the fittest and finest workers in the world and needed more food for hard days of labor in factory and field. But American boys were frail, soft, and unmasculine. You should eat more corn and sugar, but eat less corn and sugar. You should eat canned food, but eat fresh food. And avoid all those newfangled medicines, but oh hey, check out the new medicine show in town. So basically, like today. And in hopes of clearing up all this mess, Congress commissioned the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA, to study nutrition scientifically. And the scientist they put in charge of that project was Wilbur Olin Atwater, who in 1894 published the first step towards nutritional guidelines for food. It was a start. He expanded on this in his 1895 official USDA report, Food and Diet. And the core idea was simple. Food is anything that we take in that builds tissue or creates energy. The most healthful food is that which supplies the building blocks and fuels we need in the right proportion without upsetting our digestion. The cheapest food is that which has the most nutrients at the least cost. The best food is that which is both most healthful and cheapest. The average family spent 50% of its money on food alone. We saw more memos over the next few decades, but one in particular stands out. Farmer's Bulletin 717, Foods for Young Children, which introduced the idea of 5 food groups: milk, eggs, and meat, breads and cereals, butter and wholesome fats, vegetables and fruits, and simple sweets. We see here the shift from announcing the science to providing practical, immediate tips that families can use. Then came World War II.
America prepares. All America alters its pattern of life and work to meet the demand for protection.
For perhaps the only time in American history, the government, food producers, and the media were on the same page. Eat more of the right stuff. Malnutrition was a real problem, and the government wanted people in fighting and working shape on a tight budget with rationed resources. The media happily joined in with messages on how to achieve this, and food producers were striving to grow, process, and transport more. You can see this in the Food for Freedom Informational Handbook, which provided farmers guidance on what plants and resources would be demanded. Basically, a lot more of just about everything. And at the height of this came the Wartime Nutrition Guide. The Nutrition Guide introduced 7 food groups based on the nutrition that was believed to be in each group. After the war, the USDA continued to put out guidance on good diet, good cooking, good saving, safe eating. The most important of that guidance being the Food for Fitness Daily Food Guide. Released in 1958, the guide marked the introduction of 4 basic food groups, but officials became alarmed by a new trend: softness.
I welcome this opportunity to speak to the people of America about a subject which I believe to be most important, and that is the subject of physical fitness. This should be a matter of concern to us all. A country is as strong really as its citizens, and I think that mental and physical health, mental and physical vigor go hand in hand.
Driven by the fear that growing waistlines and inactive school kids made America vulnerable to the dread specter of communism, President Eisenhower and his successors made health and fitness a national mission. And in 1977, the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs released the Dietary Goals for Americans, the first time the government explicitly outlined not just advice, but goals for the American people. To say the least, it was not a smooth process. And new guidelines were released in 1980 that didn't really make anyone happy either. In 1983, Congress directed the creation of a Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, composed of experts outside of government to advise when formulating future guidelines. This process was formalized by the National Nutrition Monitoring and Related Research Act in 1990, which set out how we'd create all future guidelines and mandated that the Department of Health and Human Services now, and the USDA, together would be responsible for putting out guidelines every 5 years. This process marks the beginning of the modern dietary guidelines and has continued ever since. Before each edition of the guidelines, the Department of Health and Human Services and the USDA set the boundaries of the questions the advisory committee is supposed to answer, setting the scope for that committee, and selects the members of that committee. The advisory committee conducts an overview of the current nutrition science and takes in public comment on the issue, submitted by scientists, consumer advocacy groups, industry lobbying groups. They then send a report of recommendations that the agencies use to inform the guidelines. Now, the latest scientific recommendations aimed at optimizing human health are considered an input to the final report, the official dietary guidelines. So it was on the departments to use these guidelines to craft regulations, jingles, posters, pamphlets, anything that they thought necessary to best serve and educate the public on how to execute these guidelines. So when influencers say nutrition science is bunk and the guidelines are all wrong, then point to ads like this, they're demonstrating just how much they don't know, because these ads aren't the guidelines. So if we're going to answer the question of whether the guidelines made us sick, first we have to get past the misunderstandings and the deliberate misinformation and ask, what did the guidelines actually say? The first 1977 dietary goals proposed 7 distinct goals for changing the average American diet. So 1, eat only as many calories as needed, or less if you want to lose weight. 2, eat a lot more complex carbs. 3, eat a lot fewer refined carbs and sugars. Naturally occurring sugars were given a pass. 4, reduce overall fat. 5, reduce saturated fat specifically and balance poly and monounsaturated fats. 6, reduce cholesterol to 300 milligrams a day. And 7, limit salt to 5 grams a day. And of course, with these 7 goals, we end up with 7 recommended selection and preparation changes for the average American to achieve it. The end goal was to get the American public from here to here. The 1980 Nutrition and Your Health Dietary Guidelines for Americans were a very different document. A 10-page brochure, these guidelines still had 7 rules, but in a very different tone. The most obvious changes to these guidelines are the addition of alcohol and the importance of variety. There's a subtle language change, a shift from the language of reduce to avoid too much. And most of the hard targets were removed. No percentages of fats or grams of salt. These changes between guidelines may be small, but they're important. They reflect intentional choices somewhere in that chain between the research and the advisory committee and the final committee. Some of the changes come from new research or feedback from people trying to put it in action, and others just change the emphasis on different topics, like moving the advice to switch to skim milk from the plain text to a blue highlight box. And some of the changes were still weird though, like the switch from numbers to these geometric shapes, or the switch from alcohol to alcoholic beverages. Yes, I get it, but were people drinking just straight ethanol before you clarified alcoholic beverages? We see much of the same from the 1990 guidelines, with a few notable differences. The first was a change to positive wording. So avoid too much fat became choose a diet low in fat. And we also see the return of at least one quantitative measurement, total and saturated fat. And so we get to see the official opinion and how it's changed over 13 years. Short answer, it didn't. So we get small iterative changes, one step at a time, no big deal, right? Then the 1995 guidelines drop. The frame is the same, but underneath the hood, it's a complete overhaul. It introduced nutrition facts labels and how to read them. It talks about certain diets like vegetarianism and supplementation. It provides examples of good foods to get certain specific nutrients. But the biggest of all the changes in the 95 guidelines was the inclusion of the food guide pyramid. The food guide pyramid was an effort to fix the unhelpful, vague advice to choose a diet low in whatever. The pyramid itself positioned grains, vegetables, and fruits as the foundation of a healthy diet, with some dairy or meat, and encouraged very few sugars and oils. The food guide also introduced the idea of serving sizes, with guidance on what they look like to help Americans use the pyramid. Oh, we got the remodel, what's new? Well, the 2000 DGA came in with a glow up from 7 recommendations to 10. In previous guidelines, exercise was mentioned just for its impact on calories, so the 2000 guidelines pulled those out separately because they have distinct health benefits regardless of weight loss. And although there weren't separate physical activity guidelines yet, those won't come for another 8 years, we see them here, recommending 30 minutes of physical activity every day, along with strength training and some flexibility work. The food pyramid got its own separate topic, and they added a point about food preparation safety. The 2005 Dietary Guidelines took a different angle entirely. Instead of a short pamphlet designed to be read by the general public, the 2005 guidelines were an 80-plus page report aimed at policymakers and educators. The 2010 DGA were even longer, with more on healthy eating patterns, social obstacles to good eating, the food environment, and although cholesterol remains a nutrient to reduce, there's a lot more hedging language. In 2011, as an accessory to this guidance, the USDA released My Plate, a more intuitive visual display of the dietary guidelines that replaced the food pyramid. Unrestrained by the need to appeal directly to a public audience, and on trend with our national BMI, the guidelines continued to grow to 123 pages in 2015. The 2015 guidelines officially dropped the 300 milligram cholesterol limit, and we get a new target, keeping added sugar under 10% of total calories, leading finally, as of recording, to 4 guidelines in 2020. Follow a healthy dietary pattern at every life stage. That last part was added because the 2020 guidelines now include infants and toddlers. Customize and enjoy nutrient-dense food and beverage choices to reflect personal preferences, cultural traditions, and budgetary considerations. So find a healthy pattern that fits within your life rather than trying to fit a specific pattern. Focus on meeting food group needs with nutrient-dense foods and beverages within calorie limits. And limit foods and beverages higher in added sugars, saturated fats, sodium, and limit alcoholic beverages. So we've crossed a century and a quarter of time, and what do we have? It's messy. Since the first dietary goals, most of the science has held up, and some didn't. Most of the recommendations are pretty constant, but some changed. And the tools we use to convey that information and drive actual change in the population have constantly changed until we're where we are today. But now that we know how the guidelines came about and what they actually say, we're equipped to answer the grifters' question, did they make us sick and fat? The myth around the dietary guidelines said that things were generally fine before the dietary guidelines were introduced. Those dietary guidelines were wrong, the American people followed them, and because those guidelines were wrong, we have an epidemic of chronic illnesses like diabetes and risk factors for those illnesses like obesity. This invites an obvious question. If we were eating just fine leading up to 1980, why were the guidelines even written? There's a dumb, deep conspiracy that the government wants us to be sick and unhealthy so that we're docile and can't rebel. And there's a soft conspiracy that bureaucratic governments expand to control more and more of people's lives just kind of by their nature, and food producers were lobbying the USDA to help them sell their products. And you know what? Yeah. But the dietary goals were written in 1977. So what did food look like before then? We talked about this earlier in the history, but let's zoom out a little bit. World War II drove an immediate push for fitness. And in the years that followed, we saw the spread of bodybuilding culture, yoga culture, the jogging craze, and the modern gym. But we also saw a rising anxiety about American fitness, best exemplified by an article in Sports Illustrated just a decade after the end of the war. The report that shocked the president warned that the US was rapidly becoming the softest nation in the world. The report they were referring to was a study conducted by Bonnie Pruden and Hans Kraus, finding that only 9% of European youngsters failed a specific physical test, and 58% of American kids failed. This anxiety covered both growing bodies and changing social norms. And the 1977 dietary goals make the case for this growing problem very clearly.
We put candy machines in our schools, serve high-fat lunches to our children, and place cigarette machines in our workplaces. The American marketplace provides easy access to sweets, soft drinks, high-sugar cereals, candies, cakes, and high-fat beef, and more difficult access to foods likely to improve national nutritional health.
Anxiety isn't reality. And what if in our alarm about those darned communists, we caused the problem? Most of the influencers like to point to graphs like this that show reasonably constant, slightly rising rates of obesity through the 1960s and 70s, then a sudden surge in 1980, which they then use to point to the guidelines. They're published in 1980, and look, that's when it started. But some researchers suggest the roots of the obesity epidemic started a long way before then. You have to pull threads from different sources because century-old data, surprise, isn't great. But we can start with a study of Citadel Military Academy cadets between 1880 and 1920. It found that in 1890s, the average cadet would be considered underweight by today. But by 1920, those same cadets had gained about 3 inches in height and about 16 pounds. And comparing these two values to the very first national surveys, we see between those there was another clear increase in BMI between 1910 and 1960. These snapshots are a key piece of this story. But to get a full picture, you'd have to see how obesity changed in different groups based on when they were born instead of just an average. This is harder to measure, but it makes sense. If I have $100 now and $1,000 in 2 years, maybe I got a job and saved a little extra every month. Or maybe I mugged a guy yesterday and he had $1,000 in his wallet. To get a better picture, you need more snapshots in between, or you need to have some kind of insight into my environment and the choices that I made between those points. And because people tend to retain those food habits of childhood into adulthood, at least partially, we can learn some of those environmental and choice factors by studying how obesity changes based on the decade people are born, and that'll show long before a meaningful change shows up in the average. Using this type of analysis, Komlos et al. Found that the rise in obesity we recognize today as an 80s problem started in the 50s among school kids. And when a similar analysis is applied to adults, we see the curve starting in the 1950s, 60s. This research story isn't perfect. These studies have limits, but the grifter story that we were doing fine and the guidelines ruined everything doesn't hold at all. The evidence tells a very different story. Malnutrition, reflected in the literally shrinking bodies of Americans at the turn of the century, triggered the USDA to try to fix this problem. Whether that was effective or not is irrelevant because industrial advances had mostly turned that around by the 1920s. During World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, we saw BMIs flatline, but shortly after each, we saw a slight surge in body size as Americans walked away from each war with favorable trade agreements, better industrial capacity, and not having to deal with war on its own soil. Work changed, labor-saving technologies came up, social norms changed, and those post-war economics meant that by the early 1960s, bodies were already changing. Americans knew it, and we made the guidelines as a reaction to these changes. Of course, I can already hear the argument, sure, but looking at the charts, something happened. Maybe the guidelines made it worse. And that's a legitimate argument. So let's ask a different question. Did Americans actually follow the guidelines? If the recommendations themselves were wrong, that would be a problem if Americans actually followed them. The grifters kind of assume this as a given.
This is the worst possible advice. We listened, and the result is the worst epidemic of obesity.
Dr. Hyman may be wrong, but he brings up an important issue. There's a difference between what we think we ate, what we say we ate, and what we actually ate, especially when we're talking about what we ate 50 years ago. So we have to rely on hard data, which isn't as simple as it might sound. Because you can ask people what they eat, but they can lie or misremember. So you have to be very careful about the questions you ask and how you ask them. You can track how much they buy, but what about wasted food or stores that don't share their sales data? And you can track how much food is grown or made, but how do you know for certain where it's going? Chicken bits might go under your table, or they might go into your dog food. You can't just pick a single study or a pretty graph from one source and declare that Americans have been following the guidelines. You have to do your best to pull multiple, sometimes conflicting threads into the best story that you can. Of course, it would make my life a whole lot easier if someone had already done the work of comparing what Americans eat to what the guidelines say they should eat and giving it, like a score, something really simple, and oh, look, it's the Healthy Eating Index. Starting in 1995, the Healthy Eating Index, or HEI, sampled large portions of the population about their eating and graded their responses based on whether they were getting enough of the good food and not too much of the bad stuff. It doesn't provide an apples to apples comparison because the eating index changed as the guidelines changed. But as a snapshot of the last 30 years, it pretty consistently shows that no, we haven't followed the guidelines. And about 90% of the population ranks as poor or needs improvement each year. It also helps us to address specific stories about food. Like, what about the story that we cut fats and replaced it with sugars and grains? Nope. For adults, by using the HEI 2020 guidelines, we're particularly bad at overeating fat, saturated fat, and undereating fruits and whole grains. But the HEI is just one approach. It only goes back to 1995, and it has its own issues, so let's pull in another thread. Going back to the 1977 dietary goals, remember this graphic of what Americans were eating compared to what the goals were recommending? Although it's broken down by macros and not food groups, we see that they were recommending a 50% reduction in added sugars, a little over a doubling of vegetables, whole grains, and fruits, a 25% cut in total fat, and 40% cut in saturated fat. And in 2005, 30 years later, we see the same pattern. We're massively short on whole grains, fruits, and vegetables, eat too many refined sugars, and a little too much meat. Still, what we're really trying to do is measure the way the food environment changed after the guidelines. What if we had a method that didn't rely on survey data and that was consistent from the period before the guidelines to the... Oh, hey, it's the Economic Research Service. The USDA tracks the production and supply of food through the Economic Research Service, or ERS. And although it doesn't tell you what's on one person's dinner plate, it reflects major shifts in what we're eating. Because if Americans follow the guidelines, then that should have had a big impact on the food that producers make and sell. The USDA report, Trends in the Food Supply, 1970 to 1998, is really useful because it covers that section right before the guidelines and through their implementation. So what do we see? In some ways, we actually responded. We ate less red meat. We ate fewer eggs. We drank more reduced fat milk. Per capita, we ate more fruits and vegetables, and we ate more grains. But in many other ways, we really didn't follow the guidelines. So total meat consumption actually went up, most of that being in the form of chicken. Total added oils and added fats went up. Animal oils and fats holding kind of steady, while vegetable oils increased by 25%. The ERS also gives us key insights into how people could think they're following the guidelines when they're actually not. So yes, we reduced whole fat milk, but our actual intake of dairy fat stayed pretty constant because we ate more cheese and cream, often added in packaged food products. The same is true of sugar. We did cut down on the use of table sugar, but total sugars went up, mostly in the form of corn syrup. Again, something that gets added in the factory, not at the kitchen table. Whether you look at dietary surveys or the food market, the story that emerges is that we made an attempt. We did change some food habits and food choices, but we were never in line with the guidelines. Because put in its plainest English, we were told to reduce our consumption of high saturated fat, salty animal foods and replace it with whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. And we didn't do that. We ate more grains, mostly refined grains, more vegetable oils in the form of packaged products like chips, and we had either the same or a little bit more of everything else. You cannot say we followed the diet and it made us sick and fat when we didn't follow the diet. There's another key element to this story, and this is where I have to apologize because I buried the lead a little bit on that previous report. So that ERS report from 1970 to 1998, the ERS has actually been measuring food production since 1909. We did eat less red meat after the guidelines were released, but we had been eating less red meat for decades. We did cut eggs, but egg consumption was declining for decades before the guidelines ever came out. The same is true of whole milk, actually. And some diet guru grifters particularly point to grains as what made us sick and fat. And our great-grandparents had so much better diets. So when were we eating the most grains? 1909. Americans as a nation acted a lot like frustrated dieters, focused on the plan and the things that we were doing right according to the plan, without always being aware of what we were doing outside of that spotlight. And so we end up blaming the plan for failing us or blaming ourselves for failing to follow the plan. Which is a shame, because if we had better equipped people to follow the guidelines, things would probably be a lot better. Each grifter in the nutrition space has to layer on a different nuance or critique, but they all have to make the same argument, that the guidelines themselves are bad, and that following them would make most everyone fat and sick. And before we continue, I want to establish that whether they believe that or not is kind of irrelevant. That rejection, that idea, is the password to the club of alternative health gurus because of the incentives. To get rich, the grifter cannot just better equip you to follow common sense, scientifically based guidelines. That would force them all into a single, highly competitive market. They couldn't just sell stories. They would have to innovate better products, tools, educational media that would actually solve problems. They'd have to serve a range of clients who were better informed instead of just selling a new next best thing like a fashion trend. They could be judged by recognized standards and held accountable for their results. Wellness as an industry would become a commodity, which would drive quality up at least to a minimum bare standard and become more accessible to a wider range of underserved and marginalized people as the prices drove down. To the grifter, that's pretty much the most horrible outcome imaginable. So Mark Hyman, Jordan Peterson, and the glucose goddess may disagree about certain issues, but they all need to be on the same side of the firing line here. The guidelines can't just be not good enough or a little wrong. They have to be actively harmful, which almost inevitably leads these alt-diet gurus down a conspiracy path when they start running out of explanations for how so many people continue to let such obviously harmful advice run unchecked. It would be a shame for them if the guidelines could be codified into a diet, something that we could study and compare to the standard American diet and evaluate the Oh, look! It's DASH. DASH is the acronym for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. What is DASH? It's a diet that emphasizes eating lots of vegetables, fruits, and whole grains, eating some fat-free or low-fat dairy, fish, poultry, beans, nuts, and vegetable oils, reducing sodium to 2,300 milligrams or less, and reducing or cutting out fatty meats, full-fat dairy, tropical oils, sweets, and sugar-sweetened foods like soda or sugar-added juice. I feel like we've heard this advice before. The specifics between DASH and the USDA guidelines differ slightly. For instance, grains get 6 to 8 daily servings in DASH compared to 6 to 11 in the food pyramid. But the overlap is massive. If you're eating DASH, you are on track with the guidelines. And DASH is even recommended in the guidelines. So, how does it do? Well, DASH is ranked in the top 3 best diets in the US News and World Report's rankings pretty much every year for good reason. It's been found to help improve insulin resistance in diabetic patients and help manage diabetes. It reduces the risk of gout and the occurrence of flare-ups. Over a short 11-week trial, DASH improved hypertension over the standard American diet, and eating the DASH diet was found to reduce BMI both in sick patients, like those with fatty liver disease, and also in the general population, as found in this meta-analysis of 13 randomized controlled trials. Grifters like to call the guidelines an experiment, like a mad scientist unleashed them without evidence on an unsuspecting populace.
And it was the largest uncontrolled experiment ever done on humans, and it failed.
Based on no evidence, weak evidence, or if you're Jordan Peterson, fraudulent and corrupt evidence.
So my understanding is that the food pyramid was actually produced not by scientists or by MDs, but by the Department of Agriculture. And it was a marketing scheme, essentially.
Even if Dr. Peterson was right about the 77 goals, he's not right about this or most anything. Since their creation, they have been studied, they've been refined, and when they are followed, they do a pretty decent job. Sure, if you ignore all evidence to the contrary, ignore history, cherry-pick your data, and frame the guidelines in the worst way possible, you can make anything look bad. But that would be called bad faith argument. And it's not just misleading, it's a lie. The grifters who play this game are actively lying to you. They know they're stretching the evidence, and as soon as you see it, blacklist them, mute and block their social media accounts, mark their newsletters as spam, burn their fields, and salt their earth. They've proven they're not interested in the truth or your health. They're in bad faith, and the best way to actually stop them is to signal to the platforms that host them.
And now back to your regularly scheduled program.
So that's it. The grifters are wrong. They don't know where the guidelines came from. Many of them don't actually know what are in the guidelines. They don't know how the guidelines affected the American diet. They don't know what we ate back then. And honestly, many of them don't know what Americans eat today. In large part because they don't actually care. They just want you to buy their latest book or supplement stack. You can ignore what they have to say about the guidelines because it's misinformed, biased, profit-driven, and factually incorrect. And if we did collectively ignore their advice and support people in finding better ways to follow the guidelines, we might actually make an impact in a way that none of these figures has been able to achieve. They're wrong, the guidelines are right. Trust the science. Right? As you can guess from the title, this isn't going to be that kind of video. Because if the guidelines were an effort to stem the rise in BMI and encourage healthier eating, they have for the most part failed, despite decades of messaging, a monopoly on legitimacy, and billions of dollars in research and marketing funding. And to understand that failure, we need to grapple with why, and why some of the grifters are sometimes correct. I'm going to start from the kindest criticisms and work my way up. There is a model, an idea of nutrition that has made the guidelines vulnerable to misunderstanding and exploitation. It started all the way in the beginning, and it goes something like this.
In a sense, the body is a machine. Like other machines, it requires material to build up its several parts, to repair them as they wear out, and to serve as fuel.
Since the early 1900s, we've had food groups, first 5, then 7, then 4, then back to 5-ish in the food pyramid. But why? When we look back at the engine mental model, if you're trying to figure out the best mix of foods, you need to know what the right raw ingredients are and which foods have them. Based on that limited early knowledge, Atwater classified food in a few loose categories. Meats and similar foods, or proteins, fruits and vegetables for their mineral matters, and cereals for their cellulose and starches. Each of these made a distinct contribution to raw materials. And then there were the raw fuels, sweets and fatty foods. So make sure you get enough of the raw material stuff, top off the rest of your energy needs with those sweets and fatty foods, and you have a diet that is complete and balanced. In service of that, Atwater encouraged variety to cover your bases. And when you think about it, it makes sense. Imagine if wheat had an anti-nutrient that could only harm you in large enough doses, or if it was lacking in some micronutrient we didn't know about that was present in other foods or other grains. If wheat was the only grain you ate and the primary food in your diet, you'd be in trouble. Variety kept you flexible. It meant you could find cheaper options at market, and it covered what we scientifically didn't know at the point, which was quite a bit. Over time, we refined the food groups and what foods should go into which, and the more we learned, the deeper we locked in this Voltron model of eating food groups to achieve a complete, balanced, and varied diet. We aimed to make better groupings, but we left those fundamental assumptions intact. Get foods from every group, get them in the right amounts, preferably at or near the same time. But the more we learn, the more those assumptions fall apart. Here's a shocker: we don't actually need dairy to be healthy. It's the least qualified food group on the list. We don't need meat. We don't even need fruit. We don't need eggs, leafy vegetables, tubers, grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, poultry, seafood, or any one of these to be healthy. In the right conditions, any one or all of these could be a good fit, and having the option of all of them is great, but no one is needed. And when you think about it, it makes sense. Like, isn't it weird that we evolved in a world where dairy was rare or not accessible at all, where a lot of American adults can't drink dairy, period, without some kind of additive supplement, yet your healthy eating index score started at 90 out of 100 if you didn't get it? We evolved as omnivores in a variety of environments with different available foods in different seasons. Some groups thrived eating mostly plants, others mostly animals. Some had no fish. Some ate mostly fish. For the Hadza Bay, as one example, 90% of their diet is made up of different combinations of local berries, tubers, baobab meat, and honey. There are constellations of eating patterns that will work, and this isn't just a theoretical problem. First, agricultural interests can exploit the idea of a complete diet to force their food on your plate, dairy being the worst offender. Because it's a food group and every food group has to be there to have a complete and balanced meal, they get free prime advertising on the USDA MyPlate. But more directly, because milk is considered a key food group, the National School Lunch Program mandates that schools must offer at least 2 milk options for kids' lunches. So when the mayor of New York City proposes a ban on sugar-sweetened chocolate milk, the dairy lobby already has the upper hand. Kids need a balanced, complete lunch, and if they don't like low-fat milk, you need to push sugar into that milk in order to get them to drink it. Second, it leaves a loophole for the grifters. A lot of constellations can work. They'll certainly work better than the standard American diet. So when the grifter shares thousands of testimonials for their no grain, no dairy, or no fruit diet, it delegitimizes the guidelines. They can say, they told you this can never work, but look how many people are getting and staying healthier on my diet. I said I would start with my lightest complaints, and that's true. Food groups are a minor issue. If you keep them broad enough, they can work. And at some level, they're inevitable. We have to be able to categorize food in ways that are practical to follow when we're deciding what should be on our plate. The next step up the ladder is how the guidelines fixated on specific nutrients and micronutrients. Just like with the food groups, this made sense based on the science and ideas of their time. With the discovery of vitamins, we could literally cure deficiency diseases with specific foods and supplements. They were obviously important. Going back to the engine model, we see a picture of eat good things in the right proportions, don't eat bad things. And very quickly, specific vitamins and minerals quickly became the deciding factor in whether something was considered good. Again, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, and the same alt-health grifters who denounce the guidelines as being not holistic enough use that same model when they're selling their own supplements and products. But when our understanding of micronutrients is incomplete, companies can exploit that to make specific health claims. You've almost certainly seen like healthified products that are essentially just pre-existing products sprinkled with a vitamin fairy dust and sold as healthy, or ads like these that my generation remembers from Saturday morning cartoons.
Oh no, Tony.
We'll do fine after this complete breakfast, including my vitamin pack Frosted Flakes. They bring out the tiger in you.
But let's be clear, these weren't endorsements from credible authorities. These were just marketing that our regulators and politicians didn't have the courage to shut down. But sometimes this nutrient fixation directly led to official endorsements that muddled the public understanding of what was healthy and encouraged us to eat that delicious, heart-healthy treat. Pop-Tarts? In 1988, the American Heart Association, a private but respected organization of medical professionals, proposed the Heart Check certification. If you live in the US, you've seen this icon, and it signifies that the product meets criteria for fat, saturated fat, sodium, and certain nutrients. What it really meant is that products that technically met those criteria could pay the AHA fees for their endorsement. And if you pay a lot of money, the AHA will exclusively endorse your brand of grapefruits and no one else's. Now, I'll specify for legal reasons that the AHA's official stance is that this isn't an endorsement.
We don't endorse products. We call those food certification programs or corporate relationships. None of this constitutes an endorsement.
I mean, I don't really know how it's not an endorsement when your seal includes the organization name, calls the product a heart-healthy food, and your brand guide tells companies to capitalize on the AHA's trusted brand. That original Heart Check certification was approved for famously heart-healthy foods like Frosted Flakes, Cocoa Puffs, Fruity Marshmallow Krispies, and Pop-Tarts. How? because they technically met those nutrition requirements. They're low in saturated fat, cholesterol, sodium, and they had exactly 10% of the daily value of certain key nutrients sprinkled on as a health dust to meet those minimums. This is the inevitable result of decades of fixating on those specific nutrients, those numbers and percentages. Now, as you saw earlier, the guidelines have gotten better. We've gotten smarter as consumers. Maybe the American Heart Association and large health organizations like it learned their lesson. You won't see the Heart Check certification on Pop-Tarts anymore, but a sub-project of the AHA called the Alliance for a Healthy Generation keeps an Amazon store of healthier generation approved snacks. There are some obvious health food items, salmon, applesauce, dried cranberries, and there are some this over that choices. You see snacks that are appealing and tasty for kids that have fewer added sugars and saturated fats than what I remember when I was a kid. And then there's, you guessed it, Pop-Tarts. How did that happen? Well, let's take a look at the USDA Smart Snack Guidelines. The product has to have 200 calories or less in a serving, total fat less than 35%, saturated fat less than 10%, zero trans fats, and sugars less than 35% by weight. All check. Barely, but all check. Oh, one weird thing though. Whole grains have to be the first ingredient, okay, but it's a little confusing because it also says whole grains have to be at least half of the product, and it's clearly not. We know that by looking at the nutrition label. So whole wheat flour, it is first on the ingredients list, and the ingredients are supposed to be listed by amount. Oh, and the box says there are 11 grams of whole grains, so we actually know what is in this product. It's 48 grams total. We see from the nutrition facts that added sugars are a combined 15 grams. There's more added sugar in this Pop-Tart than whole grains. So by fabricating a Franken pastry that precisely meets the minimum definitions required, Pop-Tarts gets the designation of healthy generation approved snack. Goodhart's law states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. In the process of trying to make prescriptions that we can codify into rules, we created an environment where people are rightly confused long before the grifters show up. Now, you could say that this is the downstream result of the guidelines, that the guidelines themselves are clear. Unfortunately, that's the third major problem. Guidelines are confusing as hell. And this would be fair in 1894 when Atwater was just laying out the basic science. But even when they were supposed to be providing useful practices for the average housewife, yes, this burden was explicitly assumed to be women's work, they were incredibly complex routines of best practices to follow. The Wartime Food Guide, in my opinion, was a peak in terms of its clarity and helpfulness, in part because the mission was simple: just get enough of the right foods. After that, it kind of went downhill. The first few guidelines left completely open what too much, moderate, and plenty even were. Serving sizes were supposed to solve this problem, and the 1995 guidelines went to great lengths to explain what counts as a serving, but let's be honest. Right now, could you tell me what 1 ounce of ready-to-eat cereal looks like? Half a cup of cooked carrots? What the difference is between natural and processed cheese? And there's no world where 2 tablespoons of peanut butter and 1 ounce of lean meat is meaningfully equivalent. It's fine to expect the reader to do some work translating the guidelines into their daily practice, but I'm a coach and this is confusing to me. It's actively confusing because of this section here. They could have mandated clear labeling that aligned serving sizes on packaging to the serving sizes in the guidelines. Instead, they let corporations decide what a usually consumed portion is so that they can claim pure vegetable oil has 0 calories. and a product whose first ingredient is sugar has no sugar. And then there's the gap between the visual aids we use to share the guidelines and the guidelines themselves. My favorite example of how this confuses everyone is this video on the guidelines by Dr. Mike.
The 4 basic food groups were as follows: milk, meats, fruits and vegetables, and grains. The worst part of this guidance is that it provided no guidance for the proportions of how much you should be eating.
Despite Dr. Mike's complaint, the graphic actually does talk about proportions. You can see it right, well, hold on, if I zoom it, you can see it right there. Mike is still right here. The dominant graphic shows 4 equal-sized food groups. This is a problem, given back then how many people were illiterate, and even today, most people, when they look at a graphic like this, skim for the general idea. Now, what about the food pyramids?
What do you take away from it?
Oh, there's like different categories of foods.
I don't know what I'm supposed to be saying right now, though.
Does it tell you how much of each food you should eat?
No.
It's confusing.
I think Dr. Mike is spot on here. The My Pyramid was even more confusing than the original, so let's just skip to my plate.
While the misguided proportions of the pyramids were now gone, they also pulled a complete 180 in regards to fitness. Where'd the stairs go? We've also introduced a new word into our graphic: protein. Protein is a macronutrient, not a food group.
Sorry, Dr. Mike. I think it's great that they consolidated milk into proteins. We'll get to that later. What I wanted to highlight here was his complaint about exercise. If it's not in the graphic, to the people, it's not in the guidelines. Exercise is in the 2010 Dietary Guidelines that My Plate was built from. It was removed from the graphic because the physical activity guidelines were released separately, so the Dietary Guidelines focused on diet. But each new graphic is seen by people who grew up with the previous guidance. To someone raised through each version, the change is noticeable and signals that activity isn't important anymore. My Plate is a lot more useful and a lot less confusing. But we're still not out of the woods yet because of one more confusion that Dr. Mike highlights.
Finally see vegetables dominating the plate. While this is excellent to see, the further guidance doesn't differentiate between leafy, dark green vegetables and potatoes. As much as it breaks my heart to say so, potatoes and French fries do not count as your daily vegetable.
He's right. The 2010 guidelines and the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, famously championed by Michelle Obama, sparked a commercial war that highlighted this problem in stark detail. Schools are in a hard place. They're trying to serve students quickly, safely, with very few resources, since school lunch funding in many districts has been cut to the bone, and schools often have to rely on convenience foods at scale. Food processors are on the side of the schools here. They want to help schools deliver food cheaply. And they're willing to do the same thing Pop-Tarts did, create custom products that technically meet the guidelines, as long as they can train children to think of Doritos chips and Domino's Hawaiian pizza as good lunch choices. Grains, meat, and produce don't serve those goals. They're cheaper by the ton, but they're slow and expensive to safely store and prepare when you consider the costs of equipment, training, and manning you'll need to cook at scale. Now, it would look bad if growers and packagers insisted that kids should eat junk food, so instead they fight over what qualifies as nutritious. 2 days a week, what if we gave kids fruit juice instead of fruit? White potatoes and French fries? Starchy vegetable. And kids wouldn't eat pizza if we actually put enough sauce and vegetables on it to meet the intent of the guidelines. Let's just say that 2 tablespoons of tomato paste counts for that serving of vegetables. That's not even me paraphrasing, by the way. Here's NPR quoting a representative of the American Frozen Foods Institute.
A slice of pizza would literally be swimming in tomato paste. No kid at school is going to eat a piece of pizza that's just drenched in tomato paste.
Those are my direct complaints with the guidelines. They started from a model of our bodies as machines that led to decisions that took mostly correct science and made it at best difficult to apply. And here's where things get a little ugly. Because I kept finding myself asking, how did this happen? I'm not uniquely smart or well positioned to see these issues. I'm not even the only person talking about them. Experts like Mary and Nestle have been calling it out, writing books and articles for decades. So why have these problems been allowed to persist for so long? Oh, money. Corporate lobbying played a part in all of the problems I just criticized. But even if we got Heinz and General Mills and Coke and the dairy lobby entirely out of the process, we'd still have problems worth discussing. Egg producers were thrilled when cholesterol limits fell off the guidelines, but what finally changed the recommendation wasn't their money, but the growing pile of research that cholesterol in the food we eat doesn't necessarily raise low-density lipoproteins, or LDL cholesterol, what we typically think of as bad cholesterol that contributes to heart disease. Still, corporate influence has had a massive effect at every step of the guidelines creation process from the very beginning. Before the guidelines are even produced, major manufacturers influence the body of evidence that goes into the guidelines. Sometimes this is just fraud. Like in 2018, when a $100 million study had to be shut down because of undeclared and hidden influence by alcohol lobbyists. Other times, companies use front organizations to drive the agenda without declaring their involvement. The International Life Science Institute has repeatedly been exposed for trying to influence research and policymakers to serve the interests of the tobacco, food, and chemical companies that pay them millions. Some companies will just subcontract out the job of lying to us. For example, this published research paper, which claims to demonstrate that Americans actually have been following the dietary guidelines, was written by the contractors and employees of a legal consulting firm. And often, companies will contribute funding, they will pay for research, with the pinky promise that they'll have no influence on the results. Whether you believe that or not, researchers have long careers. The possibility that the company that funded today's research might fund tomorrow's, or might fund your colleagues' research, has to weigh on their mind as they design, conduct, and interpret the results of the study. This is one of the reasons why corporate-funded research, it does tend to come out more positive than we might expect, but more importantly, it almost never comes out negatively against the products that that company would be supporting. It's impossible to truly measure the impact this has on the guidelines, but the fact that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is supposed to look at the entire body of evidence, knowing that a lot of that evidence is poisoned by industry, starts us off on the wrong foot. And although the advisory committee has a tough job in sorting through this evidence, it's also not free from sin. A 2024 study in the Journal of Public Health Nutrition looked into the 20 members of the 2020 advisory committee and found that more than half of them had over 20 conflicts of interest with food, drink, and pharmaceutical companies. The most common conflict was research funding, and you could argue that that's just inevitable. But 13 of them received speaking fees from these organizations. 13 were board members, 12 were consultants, and 4 were employees of these companies at one point or another. And the largest single industry actor with 45 conflicts of interest with 11 members? The International Life Sciences Institute. Derek Jackson at prospect.org did a fantastic job of running through these different conflicts of interest. And it's not pretty, but it wasn't all that secret either. It's built into the process that public interests can nominate members to the committee, and these food organizations are public interest groups. So with all these conflicts of interest, numerous think pieces predicted that the 2020 guidelines would be a disaster. Pushing Twinkies, mandating infant formula for every child, and making bacon its own food group. but it didn't. Maybe our corporate overlords didn't want to push their luck. Or maybe conflicts of interest are just inevitable, and the advisory committee is, on average, staffed with well-meaning researchers just trying to do a tough job. This is where I tend to break from other critics on the influence of industry on food science and the dietary guidelines, because it's easy to point to all the threads. You can get a lot of clicks that way, and it is a problem, but it doesn't change the fact that DASH still works, that most of the 77 recommendations still hold up, that grifters exploit that delegitimacy to try to advocate for even worse ideas. And despite all these conflicts of interest, the 2020 Advisory Committee report was worse for junk food than the 2015 report when they passed it off, which marks another place where industry can muddle the process. The 2020 Advisory Committee report included a number of tighter recommendations, including 2 in particular: to reduce added sugars to less than 6% rather than 10%, and to reduce the limit on alcohol to 1 drink a day instead of 2. And the final guidelines committee said, nope. Oh, they agreed that the evidence says added sugar and alcohol isn't healthful. They just felt that the new evidence and dietary models weren't enough to change the upper recommended limits. And that's that. Done. Who knows what happened inside the black box where that decision was made? But you know what? They have a point. 1960s Americans ate more than 10% added sugar. Some hunter-gatherer societies eat more than 10% of their diet in added sugar in seasons where honey is readily available. It's not insane to suggest that an adult male can be healthy drinking 2 alcoholic drinks some days of the week and 9% of their diet in added sugars if everything else is in line. For most Americans, everything else is not in line. But that's besides the point. The final advice is, it's so defensible. Did it come from an unbiased review of the evidence? Was it a compromise between ideal and what Americans would actually do? Were the USDA's reptilian Coke overlords telling them that a limit of 6% added sugars was just one step too far? We'll never know. But this is how the guidelines came out. And the USDA and the HHS feed back into the next round as well as they present the scope of the advisory committee. When you look at the scope for the 2025 advisory committee, you might notice that one controversial item from 2020 was explicitly taken off the plate for 2025. And once the guidelines are released, industry tries to muddle the picture in all the ways we know and have already talked about. Wonder Bread claimed it helps kids' memory. Klondike claimed its light ice cream bar was 93% fat-free because it's true if you don't eat the chocolate coating. KFC claimed that eating 2 fried chicken breasts was healthier than a Whopper and compatible with low carbohydrate weight loss programs. Where it benefits them, corporations can and will use the guidelines' focus on dietary patterns to encourage the sale of individual foods as healthy or at least acceptable. You can totally fit that Coke into your otherwise healthy lifestyle. And where it benefits them, corporations can focus on individual nutrients or the absence of specific nutrients to market products as healthy. Now with calcium for strong bones. Despite its history, its vulnerability, its flaws, the guidelines themselves do support healthy eating. To make the guidelines work, policymakers, scientists, and educators would need the courage, discernment, and teeth to stick to the spirit of the guidelines and treat industry actors skeptically at best. Unfortunately, that seems to be where we're stuck. But there is hope. When we look at what matters most, health outcomes, obesity is still rising and remains a health concern, but there are signs that it's slowing. And many forms of heart disease have actually gotten better. The American public does seem to be moving slowly towards better eating patterns. And as the research shows the healthfulness of plant-forward whole food diets, Other nations are showing what's possible. In 2019, Canada updated its own guidelines, called the Food Guide, in a way that addresses many of the issues I mentioned here. It denied industry actors access to the process. It sticks to an immediately useful display and used sharp, clear language about junk food and industry marketing and its influence. It included recommendations about how to eat, things like eating with others, cooking at home, and being mindful while eating. And it ditched milk as a food group entirely, instead including it as one protein option among many. And another thing, you're watching this video right now. It's a small thing, but if you're a consumer of nutrition... So, the ending I initially scripted and recorded was kind of your typical wellness coach ending. You know, you're listening to this so you can change and you can influence the people around you to make a change.
If I can change,
Я думаю, что каждый тоже изменился
and
сегодня.
you can change,
Вы можете измениться.
everybody can change.
It didn't feel right, and I couldn't leave it in part because that's really what the grifters get wrong. They reject systemic solutions in favor of individual responsibility because they can't monetize good public health, but they can sell you supplements. So I don't want to pretend that you're going to change the world by watching this video, or even by following, liking, and subscribing. Or that you're going to get there by following the DASH diet. But I do think with a change in perspective, we can recognize when we're being lied to and where there are opportunities for us collectively to push in the right direction. So instead of giving an answer as to how to solve American eating, I'd like to point you to a few resources that I found helpful in navigating some of these questions. Danny Lennon, Alan Flanagan, and the team at Sigma Nutrition put out great evidence-based content. Their Sigma statements are really good entry-level discussions of some complex topics that are both nuanced but also readable. Simon Hill at the Proof podcast is a wealth of knowledge with some really neat insights. Just as an example, after recording this, the algorithm fed me a video where he made a point I hadn't even thought of, that the Japanese guidelines are actually very similar to the American guidelines, and yet their rates of obesity are lower, so the grifters are wrong that the guidelines are what caused that change. So, point Simon, and also go check out his work. When it comes to understanding the influence of industry, money, and marketing on food regulation and products and the guidelines themselves, I don't know anyone more qualified or experienced than Marion Nestle. Her book, Food Politics, really inspired a lot of my thoughts on this, and her following books and articles and appearances are great. So if I could, I'd like to leave you with one thought. There are a lot of food options that can work for you, and finding the routine that balances your needs with your situation is an ongoing process. I'm not going to tell you what to eat or what is best for everyone to eat. But if there's anything you got from this video, I hope that you're better equipped to recognize when you're being lied to. Whether the liar is an insecure model LARPing as a caveman or the marketing department of a fast food chain. And regardless of what you end up eating, since their marketing relies on stoking your fears and insecurities, recognizing it and cutting that bullshit out of your life, I hope just makes your life one little bit better. So, thanks for watching, and good eating.